live now. So, a very warm welcome to everyone who is joining us for today's Birthday Bash Masterclass Sky Weavers and Shark Women, Royal Women Places in Ancient Maya Inscriptions. I am very honored to be joined by Zac Lindsey today, who will be leading the class for us. To just introduce you to SASA, SASA stands for Save Ancient Studies Alliance. It works to promote the study of the ancient world and engagement with our human deeper past, building a grassroots movement through outreach, collaboration, accessibility, and public scholarship. We work towards our goal of inspiring a wide inclusive community of scholars, learners, and students. We have various live events including masterclasses, panel discussion, reading groups, book clubs, as well as RQ Gaming live sessions. We also have many educational resources and modules on our website that you can check out. We post about these quite regularly in our social media channels, and you can find us on all major social media platforms by just looking up Save Ancient Studies. A few housekeeping rules before we begin. Please be kind and respectful. Listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the session. Please be patient with technology and those administering it. Our live events are live streamed on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook, and the recordings are then posted on the same platforms. And most importantly, have fun. As I mentioned, this event is part of our birthday bash, which is one of our major fundraisers. So, if you're able to, please consider making a donation to SASA. This helps us bring our resources and events to you. You can also support your favorite triathlete by submitting their name while making the donations. Please also consider becoming a recurring donor by just making a donation of $3 a month. Thank you for joining us again. I'll now hand it over to Zach.
Okay. Can you see my screen? My name is Zac Lindsey, and I'm an archaeologist. I currently am the editor of the Institute of Maya Studies Explorer, and I'm also a board member of the Institute of Maya Studies, and I work with the Maya Exploration Center, which is run by the archaeologist Dr. Ed Barnhart. I'm here today to talk about something that I think is very interesting. It's the portrayal of women in ancient Maya art. And we're also going to be focusing on what this portrayal can tell us about where they are from in many cases and why that is important and relevant to our studies. So I called this presentation Sky Weavers and Shark Women. So we're going to talk about both of those things. We'll talk about women who had those names and why those names were important. So to go through a quick agenda of what we're going to discuss today, first I'm going to talk about who the Maya are, and we'll talk a little bit about what Maya folks do today versus in ancient times. Then after that, well, we're going to be talking about Maya hieroglyphs, and that's how we know what we know about the ancient Maya people, or one of the major sources that we have for information about the ancient Maya people. And we're going to be talking about those glyphs. So I wanted to mention to you how we can read them, how we understand what those glyphs say. After that, we'll talk a little bit about the culture around ancient Maya women, and mostly we'll be talking about elite Maya women. One of the issues with the hieroglyphs is that they are mostly referring to people in political power, so we don't have as much evidence for what the lives of commoners were like, at least from an epigraphic or hieroglyphic standpoint. That's where archaeology fills in some of the details. Because SASA is interested in ancient literature, I thought it would be fun to kind of dissect some of the terms that we see associated with women. You're not going to have to read hieroglyphics to understand this. presentation, but I am going to talk a little bit about some of the common words that were used to talk about women. We'll talk about the ish sign, which is one of the most important. We'll also talk about dynastic titles, names, and some other titles, and then we'll talk about a verb as well. After that, I'll give you 5 examples of ancient Maya women just to kind of show you how this actually worked in practice. So I'm very excited to get started. First thing I always like to say in these sorts of presentations is let's talk first about who the Maya people are. The Maya people are indigenous to southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. You might notice that I am saying who are the Maya people, and there's a misunderstanding in culture today. We often hear that Maya people all disappeared mysteriously millennia ago during the so-called collapse of ancient Maya civilization. That's not how archaeologists like to look at things anymore. In fact, archaeologists are moving away from the term collapse entirely. So you won't really hear archaeologists saying the collapse of Maya civilization. What we tend to say today is that there was a rupture event, one of many rupture events. And this event came at the end of the late Classic era. But Maya people did not go extinct. Maya civilization did not disappear. Nobody ascended into energy beings or was abducted by aliens or whatever conspiracy theories tell you on Facebook. Maya people are in fact still here. I get to hear Maya languages pretty frequently. I have a friend who speaks Maya here. I live in the city of Merida. Merida is a pretty big urban area, and unfortunately, Mayan languages are not super common here in the city itself, but as soon as you go outside of the city, you're going to start hearing people speaking the local Mayan language, which is Mayatan, or we call it Peninsular Maya. So Maya people are still very much around, but we're not really talking about the contemporary Maya people today. We're going to be talking about the ancient Maya people. And mostly today, we're going to be focusing on specifically the classic era of Maya culture. The classic era was from about 250 CE to 900 CE. We'll be really focusing more on like the 600s, the 700s. Do you need to remember that? Nope. The reason that we use the term classic era is so that you don't actually need to remember these very specific dates, right? But the classic era was the era when folks were writing the most with hieroglyphs. So I wanted to mention hieroglyphs, right? Hieroglyphs are incredibly beautiful. They're art as well as writing. They're able to express full sentences, so that's very exciting. Most forms of proto-writing that we see around the world can't express full sentences. They tend to express nouns, and that's it. So we can actually read the words and thoughts of ancient Maya people, which makes studying them, for me at least, very exciting. Unfortunately, a lot of what they wrote has not survived. So the ancient Maya wrote on lots of surfaces, everything from their bodies to books, to clothing, to stone pottery, et cetera, et cetera. Most of what we have today is stone and pottery. And the stone carvings tended to be done by elite people. That means that, unfortunately, we don't have the voices of the commoners preserved in ancient writing. And of course, that's a problem that most historians face with ancient history. The Spaniards attempted to wipe out the glyphs. So when the Spaniards arrived, people were still writing in the hieroglyphs, and the Spaniards attempted to stop it because they believed that that people were writing symbols of devils and that sort of thing. And one man in particular burned a lot of ancient manuscripts. Absolutely terrible act. Not to undermine the importance of that event, but the truth is things like paper don't survive very well in the jungle to begin with. So unfortunately, a lot of books had already been lost even before De Landa burned them. Ironically, De Landa attempted to destroy the writing system, and he also left us the keys to decipherment. But it took us a very long time to understand that key. So the sort of Maya Rosetta Stone actually existed in the public, in academia for many years before we figured out how to use it as a key to deciphering the glyphs. And deciphering the glyphs was very slow until about the 1960s and 1970s, when this woman, Tatiana Proskoryakov, proved that the glyphs recorded historic events, and she started identifying symbols in the glyphs that represented specific historic events, things like being born or acceding to the throne or dying. And since then, there have been absolutely massive changes to our understanding of the ancient Maya, really huge unlocking of information that happened. And it's taken us many years to understand just how much knowledge we've gained thanks to her work. And so we're still kind of coming out with new information. It's not like Egyptology, where we've kind of had lists of kings for more than a century. So we've had lots of time to research these folks. In many cases, we've only known the names of kings, well, I should say rulers. Kings and queens is sort of a European term, so probably better to say rulers. But we've only had their names for 20, 30 years in many cases, and we're still kind of understanding what their lives were like and what their lives meant. One of the most important things that we've discovered through analyzing the glyphs is that images who early archaeologists thought were pictures of priests are actually images of women. And so the amount of women, the names of women that we now know in ancient Maya art is pretty huge. So lots of research that we can do in that department. From reading these inscriptions, we know that ancient Maya women had power that their medieval European counterparts did not. And I mean, if you sort of line them up on the timeline, right? I said we're talking here about 600, 700 CE in the Maya world versus in Europe. Women tended to have a lot more political power. Rulers' wives were advisors in court scenes. We see them frequently in the background of court scenes. And women also played roles in astronomy, trade, diplomacy. For example, the Chiknab murals show a merchant woman, this woman right here, in a position of authority. And her name appears multiple times on the Chiknab murals, very important murals from Galakmul. And so we think that she was the one who had those murals commissioned, or that they were commissioned for her. And so she must have been playing a very important role in the local merchant scene. We know from ethnographic materials that when the Spaniards arrived, women did play a big role in mercantile trade in specifically central Mexico. We have to be careful about assuming things that were happening in central Mexico were also happening in the Maya area. Very different people. And we shouldn't confuse the Mexica or the Aztecs with Maya people, but we can sort of use some analogs here. And so the fact that we have these Chiknab murals and the fact that we also have evidence that Maya women were important in trade in central Mexico suggests that they were also important in trade in the Maya region as well. La Corona panel 6, which I'll show you in a moment, shows two women engaged in diplomacy. So it's a whole sculpture that was made specifically to show this important diplomatic event, and the women and the people involved in that diplomatic event were women. So again, they must have held a lot of political power for those things to be memorialized in stone. And I kind of jokingly said that La Corona panel 6 passes the Bechdel test, right? And you can see La Corona panel 6 here. This is one of the women and this is the other woman. And then they have these statues around them, which are statues of their local divinity or supernatural lords. That said, we shouldn't pretend the Maya were egalitarian. We have to avoid the temptation of rose-tinted glasses. For example, there's an image of a creepy old man with a group of young women surrounding him. Probably not a sign of equality there. Another thing is that marriages were likely arranged, and while this wasn't common among all social classes, we do know that at least a few rulers had multiple wives, and these wives were placed in a hierarchy. So again, we don't want to, I don't want to imply that ancient Maya women were on equal footing as men, that they didn't face discrimination. But that said, they certainly had a surprising amount of political power. Now, anthropologists who have reported on arranged marriage in general say the Maya version is one of the more better arranged marriages, not to say there is such a thing, but the Maya version as it exists as it existed in the 1990s and in a few areas still exists today, it does actually give women a chance to pull out. It gives their families a chance to pull out. And one of the ways that women have the right to pull out of these arranged marriages is if the arranged partner is abusive specifically. So there was safety built, or there is safety built into these arranged marriages. That said, we don't know if that was true in the classic era too, and we can sort of assume that if you were a noble woman and you were being forced to marry the guy from across the way, and it was for political reasons, you might not have had very much choice in the issue, unfortunately. But we do know that Maya women did have a lot of power, and I want to talk about some of those powers that they had. So again, I really like Sasa because we delve into ancient literature. When we do the classes, we look at ancient literature in translation. It's a chance to see ancient people's thoughts about themselves. It's, in my opinion, way better than looking at, well, my opinions about this versus, the actual inscriptions themselves. So that's one of the things I really like about Sasa. And although we don't have time to read any full inscriptions in this presentation, I did want to at least look at some of the words and vocabulary that surrounded women in ancient Maya times. For example, here we have what is known as the ish sign. This X is pronounced like an SH, and that's an old Spanish custom. When the Spaniards arrived, the X sound, as they were writing it at the time, was pronounced like an SH. So although it looks like it should be Ix, it's actually going to be pronounced ish. And this sign right here is a woman's face, and she has a tattoo on her cheek that kind of coincidentally looks like the letters IL. Now, many people have pointed out to me when I teach them about ancient Maya hieroglyphs that she doesn't look all that feminine, right? And we're projecting contemporary Western beauty standards on this image. So she doesn't look what we would traditionally say is feminine, and that's probably intentional. So Maya beauty standards, especially for royalty, evolved around concepts of androgyneity. So her face is not distinctly what we would consider feminine on purpose, right? I think the Ish sign is interesting because it has an archaism in it. So writing often features archaism. Writing develops slower than other cultural trends. We see it even in English today. There are so many words that have vowels, sounds that we used to pronounce in the past but don't pronounce today. A famous word like night, which originally would have had the GH sound pronounced as a guttural sound, nich, right? That's an example of archaism in writing. And this actually happens in Maya writing as well. So I mentioned the idea of the classic era. Before the classic era was the very creatively named pre-classic era. And this il tattoo, the IL tattoo that I mentioned before, was common in images on the pre-classic, but we don't see it as much in the classic era. So here's the wife of the corn god. We call her the wife of the corn god today. She may be an analog of a character named Ishkik from the Pol Pol Gu. We're not exactly sure, but she's from the pre-classic era, so she's from before most of what we're talking about today, 300 BCE or maybe a little later. So the tattoo stayed in writing even after it had faded from fashion. So it's an example again of archaism appearing where at some point this tattoo was heavily associated with femininity, was heavily associated with possibly the wife of the corn god or the female corn god. But later on, as time went on, the tattoo disappeared, but it continued to play a role in writing as a sign of femininity. And with this Ish sign, we often see what we call emblem glyphs. So when we first started talking about emblem glyphs, when we first started reading hieroglyphs, we thought they were place glyphs. We thought they were directly the name of the place where we were finding them at. So this changed our ideas about what places were called, places like Palenque, for example. We thought that its name was Bacal for a little while in ancient times. We now know that emblem glyphs are not actually place names, although they do tend to be heavily associated with places. We now kind of understand them a little better as dynastic glyphs. So they're basically the name of the dynasty that was in charge of a certain region. A dynasty could move its base to another place and continue using the same emblem glyph. Over time, a dynasty could fall out of favor and a new dynasty could come into power in the same region, and suddenly the emblem glyph would change. That said, we can still sort of use these a little bit as stand-ins for places if we know sort of what places the dynasty tended to be most popular at. So they do hint at where someone was from. If we see a certain dynastic glyph, they were born within that dynasty's power region. Women bear dynastic glyphs of their place of birth, but they're often found very far from home. So we see these emblem glyphs or dynastic glyphs in other places when they're associated with women. That tells us that women tended to be the one to move when there was a marriage situation. And I wanted to kind of explain the emblem glyph really quickly, just so that you can sort of get an idea of how ancient Maya writing worked. Again, I mentioned that this is the Ish sign, and we can identify it by this IL glyph on her cheek here. And then over here, we have two other signs. These are actually two different glyphs. This one here looks like a snake, and sure enough, it is the symbol for Kanul, or the snake, right? And then up here it says ahau, the word ahau. The word ahau is a word that we often translate as king or leader. Leader is probably a more a better term than king. King conjures up a lot of specific European ideals. So a lot of people don't really like to use the word king when they're talking about ancient people. And in this case, it's more meant to be, again, the dynasty. So we would translate this as Ish. We would read it as Ish Kanul Ahau, but we would translate it as Lady of the Snake Dynasty. And interestingly, I chose the Snake Dynasty on purpose. One, they're a very well-known dynasty. Calakmul is where these people tended to be from. Before Calakmul, they were from a place called Sibanche. Calakmul is a very, very large city in southern Mexico, in the Petén region of southern Mexico. Absolutely beautiful ruins to visit today. And during the ancient Maya times, it was one of the two most powerful ancient Maya cities during the Classic era. Interestingly, many of the most politically influential Maya women were from places associated with the Snake Dynasty. So that makes me wonder, I don't want to, again, this is not a guarantee here, but it does make me wonder if there was some sort of ideological significance to that fact, where women were allowed to have more political powers in Calakmul than in other places in the Maya world. Not to say we don't see leaders who were women in other places, but a lot of the rulers that we do see who were women who had high levels of political power did come from Calakmul or were associated with Calakmul. And I'll mention that again when we're talking about some of those five specific women that I wanted to mention. So that was the dynastic titles are really important. They show us where a woman was from, but we also have the names of many ancient Maya women, and we have some other titles that are associated with them as well. I don't normally like to translate names. For example, my name has something to do with, I honestly forget what my name means, but it's, my name is Zachary, and it has something to do with God and this sort of thing in Hebrew. And my mother actually picked my name because she liked Richard Gere's character in An Officer and a Gentleman, who was named Zachary, right? So the significance of my name has no bearing on my personality or who I am. Now, but with ancient Maya rulers, they did pick their dynastic names. So sometimes understanding what the significance was underneath them is useful. That said, we don't always understand what that significance was. And in some cases, it may have been the Richard Gere situation with my name. Did someone name themselves the name that they chose because of its religious significance, or did they name themselves that because they had a mentor who had a similar name, or a grandfather who had a similar name, or did they just name themselves that because it sounded cool? We don't exactly know. So I will mention the translation of some of the names. Here's an example. We'll mention this woman again. Her name is, again, here's the Ish sign. You can see the IL tattoo is covered up by something else here. Kaabel, which is hand. And then she seems to be lifting this thing with cross hatching on it, and that is the Nab sign, or water lily. So Ishkab el Nab, which is something to do with hand of the water lily or water lily hand or water lily in hand. Don't exactly understand what the name means or why she chose it. So translating it doesn't do a whole lot of good. And she might not have thought of her name being translated. That said, there are some that are important. The translations can be important. For example, Six Sky Weaver. We'll come back to her in a second. But we see a few important women who share this name, Six Sky Weaver, and they may have chosen it intentionally. There's a little bit of confusion about some of these titles because sometimes women will carry titles like Ishbakab, and those are the same titles that their husband might choose. So if they're choosing the same titles that their husband chose, does that mean they actually held that political position, or is it a position that their husband held and they were sort of saying, and the misses, right? We do know that there is an example of a Sahal. Sahals are lesser lords. His wife had the same title as him. And we think in that case that she was not a Sahal herself, that her husband had the title of Sahal, and he was the one who was actually in that position, but she was using the title again as a sort of Sahal and Mrs., right? That said, there are some titles that there's a little bit more ambiguity. We do think there was a woman who was part of a secret organization known as the Sakwais, or a little-known organization known as the Sakwais, and she does seem to have been important in that organization. And it doesn't seem like her husband also had that same role, so she held that role independently. There are also some titles that are female exclusive, and we don't understand these titles quite as well as we understand some of the male exclusive titles. Is that because of sexism in archaeology? I don't know. But one of them that we see a lot is this one. I have my ideas about it. I'm going to share my ideas with y'all. These are my ideas. I haven't had them peer reviewed. They're not published anywhere. But just so that I'm not putting a big question mark on this the whole time, I'll at least give you my ideas. This is a title that we see fairly commonly for royal women specifically, especially at Yaxchilan. We have not found any men that hold this title. So we do think that it is a woman-specific title. Now, when we don't know a glyph, we say question mark, and we just leave it as a question mark. We can read about 80% of the Maya glyphs today, which is really good, and that definitely helps us to understand the bulk of what we're looking at. There are, however, that does mean there's 20% of glyphs that we cannot read, and that's a pretty big number, and that definitely interferes with our understanding of ancient Maya culture. And one of the glyphs that we can't read, unfortunately, is this one here, which looks like an upturned pot, right? Here's the well, it's an olla, right? And so here's the water storage area, and then here's the spout. So we would read this as question mark la ishik gu, which is holy woman. So it's holy woman of something. And we don't, again, exactly know what the of something is. But there's this very interesting image here of Ishchel, who is a supernatural lady who is in charge of midwifery, and she's an old goddess. So she may have had connections to the first humans. And you can see here she is pouring out something from this, something that looks very similar, a similar container to this symbol. And she's pouring out, and she has her hand down in this kind of way, right? She has her hand down, which in other contexts is a sign that she is giving, or that it's a sign of abundance. Rulers scattering incense or scattering blood, or deities, supernatural beings giving gifts of water and abundance. So it's possible that she is sort of giving this gift of abundance to the world down here, and so she has some sort of role in agriculture. And that would make sense with some other things that we know about her. So in that case, I personally think that this word here, the word that is missing, might be the word hoyal. And so if it's hoyal, it means pouring. So maybe she is the holy pouring woman, signifying that she has some sort of role in agriculture. whether it was a symbolic role where she was meant to invoke concepts of fertility, or whether she actually had some role in ensuring that agriculture was happening correctly and organizing the agricultural process. We don't know. But we do know that this title was one that only women could have, and it was a very important political title, and especially common at Yaxchilan. The last specific glyph that I wanted to mention before we talk about some women who were important in ancient Maya culture, so you can get an idea of who these women actually were, is the concept of arrival. And this is something that we see with both women and men, but it really has an importance for women that seems to be very specific to womanhood. So royalty in ancient Maya times often took on traits of supernatural forces. You may have heard ancient Maya rulers described as shaman kings. Lots of baggage with terms like that. But the point of the term is that the rulers held both a religious role and a political role. And in many times they also held a military role as well. And to do that, to kind of combine all these roles, we often see leaders getting advice from supernatural beings. We often see leaders taking on the guise of supernatural beings or taking aspects of supernatural beings into their body and allowing the supernatural beings to speak through them. So that's one of the reasons that we use this term shaman. Again, you know, that term has a lot of baggage, but we run into the situation where if we're not using terms like this, we just have to use the original terms that the ancient Maya used, and then I have to explain what they mean in some way. So shaman king tends to be a nice short form of that. Royal women also tended to take on aspects of divinity. So they also had a religious component and a religious role. And royal women tended to the Lady of the Moon, whose name was Ishu. Again, we see this sign, this word Ish, which means lady. So even the moon takes on this word Ish to describe her as feminine. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning arrival and concepts of arrival is I mentioned that women tended to be outsiders who came to a new town to marry into the dynasty that was already established at that town. So women did a lot of arriving at a very important part of their life when they were going to be married. So the verb used for arrival was huli, and many women, again, were born in one place, but they huli to another place. They arrived at another place, right? This verb is the same verb that was chosen to describe movements of the moon, and we see it very commonly in hieroglyphic inscriptions that have dates on them. They talk about how many days ago was the arrival of the new moon. So it does not seem to be an accident, considering how important women were, the important connection between women and the moon, and this act of arrival. It does not seem to be an accident that women were frequently described as arriving to a place. Not only that, but upon arrival, sometimes women performed rituals about the moon or took the guise of the moon goddess, right? The Lady of the Moon, when they arrived. And their movement from one city to another mimicked the movement of the moon. So women had a deep connection to the moon, and especially elite women, and they may have had a connection to astronomy as well. I'll come back to that in a moment. So I've talked a little bit about the role that ancient Maya women had. I've talked a little bit about the language that was used to describe ancient Maya women. What I really like to do with this presentation, though, is talk about specific ancient Maya women, so you can start putting names on the ancient past. You know, a lot of times there's sort of a joke that I've heard is whenever we see a sculpture of a man, it's some specific famous man, but whenever it's a sculpture of a woman, it's sort of femininity in general. Or, you know, there's a sculpture in Chetumal, Mexico, that is of indigenous women. And right next to it is a sculpture of an important general, or across the street from it is an important general. He's listed by name, but we don't have the name of this specific indigenous woman who is supposedly being memorialized here. So when I talk about ancient Maya women, I want you to also get to know some of the actual ancient Maya women. So I'm going to talk about a few who I think are very interesting. Lots more than this. We could go into depth on other ones. I've left out some of my favorites, but I wanted to only give you 5 so that later I'll give you all some resources to do a little bit more reading about this subject if you want. And so you can delve into some of them yourself. So the first one that I'm going to start with is, again, Ish Kawil Ek. And if we wanted to translate her name, we would translate it as Lady Kawil's Star. And she was from a place called Goba. Goba is in today contemporary Quintana Roo, Mexico. I highly recommend visiting it. I actually recommend, if you're in the Tulum area, I recommend visiting it instead of Tulum because, in my opinion, it's a more impressive site, very beautiful, and it tends not to have so many people at it. So Lady Kawil Ek was not the first known female ruler, but she was one of the earliest supreme female rulers. And what I mean by a supreme female ruler is we don't see her presented as a wife of her husband, like some of these other characters that some of these other historical figures that we're going to see are portrayed, right? We don't see her as a wife. We see her as a ruler in her own sense. She's portrayed in the same poses that male rulers use. She's portrayed wearing similar clothing to male rulers, and she's portrayed using similar linguistic techniques as male rulers used. And we don't see a stele. At some other places, we see dual stele, where we have a wife on one side, stele being stone sculptures of rulers that were very important in this era. So we don't often see, so in some places we do see stele that are paired. So an image of a woman and an image of a man, and it was the husband and the wife. In the case of Koba, we don't see images of her husband, we only see her. So again, she's portrayed like any male ruler on her stele, and this implies high levels of political power. Seems like she was thought of with the same high level of political power as any ruling male or anybody that we might call a king. Kawil is even a spirit of leadership that is almost always associated with men, yet she chose to use Kawil in her name. So it seems like she was really showing that she was every bit as valuable and important as a male ruler might have been. She also talked about, she also took captives and wore military regalia. You can see her actually standing on these little people here. She's surrounded by people who have been bound, so they are captives, and they're still wearing pretty important clothing. It seems like these were high-ranking captives, right? She had these people on her stele that were very important. Does that mean, though, that she was a warrior? The first thing that I want to say about that is, again, we get some sexism going on here where there's really no question put forth by academics a lot of times when we see a man dressed as a warrior holding a captive. We rarely say, did he actually go into battle and capture this person? But there is often a bit of ambiguity because we often see, when we see images like this, we're often actually seeing ritualized recreations of events. So a man may have a captive, a ruler may have a captive, especially somebody like Yashun Balam of Yashtilan, who is shown at an older age grabbing up captives. Did he actually go into battle and grab these captives, or was he just shown ceremonially grabbing them up to make it look like he was impressive? We don't know, but we don't really ask that question very often about him. On the other hand, I have heard a lot of scholars ask the question, well, just because she's in military regalia, does that mean she went into battle? And I guess what I would say to that is military regalia was earned in ancient times, just as it is earned in many cultures today. If a ruler today appeared on national television wearing, a military uniform he or she had not earned, there would almost certainly be an outcry about it. And considering the spiritual elements of rulership in ancient times, it is hard for me to believe that people would have allowed her to appear wearing military regalia, especially if they were already skeptical of a female ruler, without having actually achieved military victories in the field. We can't say for sure, But my personal thought is, she probably did. Otherwise, she probably would not have been allowed to wear this regalia on her stele. And she may have also inspired others, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to mention her first. In fact, the next person on this list chose the date of Kawil X's death as the date she entered the city of Naranjo to rule it. So it seems like she was trying to honor the memory of her mentor when she entered Naranjo. And both of these women had some distant association to the city of Calakmul. So once again, there would have been connections, and they probably would have known about each other in ancient times. The next woman that I wanted to mention, I have her name listed here as Lady Six Sky. Previously, I wrote her actual name and then I translated it for you. Lady Six Sky, it's a little bit more complicated because there are still some debates about how we would have read her name. So her name was probably read Ishwakchan Kalam Lem, and then maybe Achao at the end here, which is a little bit of a mouthful. And the translation is also a little bit disputed. So we think it might have been something like Lady Shimmering Six Sky Weaver. But what does that mean? What is a six sky? Well, a six sky is a place. Six sky is a place. And recently I saw an argument that six, which is wuk, is also the word for centipede. So they may have written the word six as a visual pun to actually convey centipede sky. And what is a centipede sky? Well, centipede sky might be a name for the Milky Way because of its appearance, right? So the final word that is important here is the word weaver. And we do know that the moon goddess was associated with weaving. So the idea that someone would include weaver in their name when they're talking about the sky suggests that they were maybe talking about the moon goddess. That is a possibility that is enforced by the fact that Lady Six Sky here takes the form of the moon goddess. She takes the appearance of the moon goddess. She takes on aspects of the moon goddess. And here we see her in what we call Ubakilan. She's taking the image of the moon goddess. And on the sides of this inscription on this stele, which you can't see, there's more writing where she does clarify that she is taking the guise of the moon goddess. So again, the moon was really important, and very well, her name here, Six Sky Weaver, could be a reference to the moon goddess. Today, she's one of the most famous Maya rulers. So if you've heard of her, you might have heard of her in the game Civilization 6. If you've ever played that game, she is actually the ruler of the ancient Maya. She's the ruler of all the armies in the ancient Maya world, right? So in Civilization, they refer to the ancient Maya sort of as this holistic group. We now know that that is not the case. The Maya people were not united in a single empire, but in Civilization, they had to kind of pick somebody as the head of the Maya empire, which again, not a great term to use, but I do at least appreciate that they picked her. So that's pretty neat that she has made her way into contemporary video games. Civilization 6 is actually not the only video game that she's in. She's in the game Heroes of History as well. She appears in contemporary art. She's been a subject of a lot of magazine articles. National Geographic recently had an article about her. And there's even a romance novel about her. And that romance novel was out of print for years, but I just recently checked on Amazon and saw that it is finally in print again. So I think I have some reading material for the summer break. She was a child of a civil war. So her father and her half-uncle were both Mutul. And I mentioned the dynasty before. The dynasty that this particular woman was a part of was the Mutul dynasty. But her father and her half-uncle were bitter enemies, and they both claimed that they should be the ones to rule the Mutul dynasty. They both considered themselves to be the true ruler of the Mutul dynasty, and they went to war for many, many, many years. In fact, when she was a child, just 4 or 5 years old, her father was forced out of the city that he ruled by the armies of her half-uncle. So you can imagine that some of her earliest memories were of being a victim of a war, being kicked out of her homeland and forced to go elsewhere on the run. So this really framed her approach to life. She was a warrior through and through, and she spent her whole life engaged in warfare. She did some other things that were really important. One of the things that she did was, again, she changed the moon count. She changed the way that the ancient Maya people counted the moon cycles. And this was a change that spread all over the Maya world. Even her enemies adapted this change. So she was heavily involved with that change. It started during her administration, and again, it moved all over the Maya world. Does that mean that she herself was an astronomer? We can't really say. That said, the change specifically coincided with her arrival to Naranjo. She took on the guise of the moon goddess frequently. She had a name that references the moon goddess. And she definitely considered the sacred calendar to be important and is one of the rulers who picked dates that were on the sacred calendar based on all kinds of movements of planets and celestial bodies. In my opinion, that suggests pretty heavily that if she herself was not an astronomer or a student of astronomy, then at least she put important people in charge who were astronomers. So to her, there was a big value of astronomy. We also know that she commissioned a lot of art during her time in office. Some of the Homul style vases, which are very famous, they have these beautiful dancers on them. Those were commissioned during her administration. Something called the Regal Rabbit vase was commissioned during her administration. Her son actually takes the credit for the Regal Rabbit vase, but he was just 12 when it was commissioned. So even if he specifically commissioned that specific vase, the idea that there was an artistic renaissance happening during her administration was probably owed to her, not her son. Another thing that he takes credit for that she probably did were certain acts of war. So he mentions, well, both he and she claimed that he was involved in conquering certain cities when he was about 5 years old. So he probably wasn't actually going into battle himself. He probably wasn't, hard to imagine a 5-year-old even doing squirely activities in a battle. I don't think anybody in their right mind would send a 5-year-old onto a battlefield for any reason. So it's probable that she was the one who was coordinating these military acts. And once again, we see her appearing, standing on the backs of captives. We see her appearing with military regalia. So the idea that she was the one who led these military campaigns, not something that we probably will ever be able to prove definitively, but there is a lot of very good evidence for it. Just like Ishkawil Ek, who came before her. She also played with gender in a way that is pretty interesting, in my opinion, especially with the debates these days about pronouns. We can see that she used the term kuhul mutul achau. I mentioned before this ish was really important, and women tend to use it before titles to show that we're talking about the feminine version of a title. And she did occasionally use the ish mutul achau, which as I mentioned before, would probably be translated as Lady of the Mutul Dynasty. On the other hand, she also uses the Kuhul Mutul Achau, which is associated with men. And we would typically translate that as Holy Lord of Mutul. So a little bit different in how she's portraying herself. Sometimes she's portraying herself as a woman of the Mutul Dynasty. Other times she's portraying herself as the head of the Mutul dynasty, at least the head of the Mutul dynasty in the city of Naranjo. So some things going on here that we don't exactly know what the significance of it was in ancient Maya time. And I certainly wouldn't say that it was what we use pronouns for today to express the difference in gender and sexuality. So I wouldn't want to go that far, but it's clear that she presented herself in masculine ways from time to time. Another famous woman that I wanted to mention is Ish Kabal Shok, and her name literally means Lady Shark Fin. This Shok title may have been, or pardon me, the Shok name may have been a name that was associated with her ancestors, so that might have been why she took the name Shok. There's some other ideas about allusions to the dawn that we don't really understand at this point. But Lady Sharkfin or Lady Cabalshok, she was the wife of the ruler of Yaxchilan. So the other two women that I mentioned, at least Lady Six Sky was married, but she doesn't really portray herself as a wife of. She portrays herself as a ruler. In the case of Ishkabalshok, she is portrayed as the wife of the ruler of Yaxchilan. She's famously shown on lintel 24 of Yaxchilan drawing a rope through her tongue in bloodletting. Very iconic image, one of the most famous images in ancient Maya art. It's currently held at the British Museum against the wishes of many of the people of Mexico and many of the people of Yaxchilan specifically, who want it back in Mexico. Hopefully one day this important image will make it back to where it belongs. But right now it's in the British Museum. She was a very powerful political figure in her life. And we know that because of the number of monuments that feature her. We see her alone performing bloodletting rituals. But in this particular case, she does appear with her husband. And we can actually think of this as a bit of a romantic image, as crazy as it is to think, or as unexpected as it is to think of the idea of a woman drawing a rope through her tongue as romantic. Because you might even get the impression from just looking at this image that you can tell there's something more to this image. It's a little off balance on its own. Her husband stands here, and he holds a torch for her, literally holding a torch for her while she performs this intense ritual. And if you remove her from the image, he looks like he's about to fall over. If you remove him from the image, well, she looks kind of bunched up in the corner here, and it doesn't seem natural. So really, they only work when they're together. They both need to be in the image for the image to function. I wanted to show you a little bit of a zoom up of the image, so that's why I don't have the whole thing, just so you can see some of the beautiful detail on her headdress here and on her huipil and all this kind of stuff. But one other thing that's going on here that is romantic is she's actually touching his belt with her pinky. Two people touching in Maya art like this, especially this kind of Maya art, unheard of. So even though she's just touching him with her pinky, that touch was definitely meant to symbol their deep connection. That said, her husband and her deep connection may not have been as deep as it initially seems. She was again, hierarchically, she was the most important wife, but he had other wives, and at least a few of them had children as well. And after her husband died, it seems like her son took office. Records have been intentionally destroyed, so we don't know for sure, but it seems like her son took office. 8 years later, she died. But just 2 years after that, her son was also dead, and his half-brother, one of the so-called lesser wives, son of one of the so-called lesser wives, had taken over. We don't know what the political situation was. She may have been killed with her own son, and then the half-brother took over, or she may have died of natural causes shortly before her son was killed. But things do not seem to have gone particularly well for her son. And as far as this little act of romance here, touching her husband, well, unfortunately, her side of the dynasty was wiped out shortly after her death. So unfortunately, the image didn't turn out to be quite as romantic as they maybe wanted it to be. Another famous woman whose fate was a little bit better was Ishsakuk, and that name means Lady White Quetzal. Quetzals are some absolutely beautiful birds in the Maya area, very well known, very important in Maya culture. These feathers here were probably Quetzal feathers, and the Quetzal bird is normally very colorful, so she was sort of specifying that she is an albino Quetzal. She was from Palenque, and she also led a revolution in the Palenque government. So again, these events are confusing, and the reason these events are confusing is not an accident. The ancient rulers wanted to obfuscate things to make themselves look better. Unfortunate fact of reading ancient writing is that what we're seeing is intentional propaganda. Sometimes we don't really know what happened. We can only know what they wanted us to think happened. And was that correct? Was that true? We have to use other sources to verify it was true. And in some cases, we really can't say for sure. But it seems like her family member who was king at the time, who was ruler at the time, was not popular. He may have been her brother or her cousin. We're not exactly sure. We know she was tied deeply to the royal family. So we know she was a blood member of the previous royal family, but we don't know exactly what her connection was to the previous royal family. We just know that the previous king was not that popular, and eventually, and he's actually said to have not performed important rituals that he was supposed to do. So who knows what he was doing, but it wasn't what he was supposed to be doing. But Sakakuk got the support of, again, here we see the massive city of Calakmul. So once again, that snake dynasty who tended to allow women to have more political power than some other groups. So again, she got the support of Calakmul, and she used that support to overthrow her brother or cousin or whatever political relationship she had with him. And she put her son Pakal the Great onto the throne of Palenque. Here we see him taking the throne. Although he looks like an adult in this picture, he was actually only 12 years old. So they portrayed him as an adult to make him seem more, well, he along with taking the role of king, he was taking the role of adult, whether he liked it or not, at 12 years old. That said, she probably still continued to maintain a lot of political importance, especially in the first few years of his reign. Now, Pakal went on to, you might guess from the fact that he's Pakal the Great, he went on to be pretty great. Another one of the very famous Maya kings, you might have heard his name tossed around by people talking about the ancient Maya. He was actually the king who ruled the longest in the ancient world. So today we have Queen Elizabeth. She ruled for a ridiculous amount of time. But before her, and also I think Louis the Sun King, he was another very long-ruled ruler before. But before any of them, Pakal was the longest ruling ruler. He ruled for 60 years or more, which was 70 years, or more, which was quite a lot in ancient times. And he lived to be 82 years old. And he did a lot of things during his reign after his mother died. But before she died, she clearly continued to play a very important role in Maya government. And you can see she has that title that I mentioned, which might be Holy Pouring Lady or something similar. Here's the vase or the pot that is tipped upside down, and then here's the woman sign. Eventually, though, Palenque sided against Calakmul, and it's not clear what was happening with that. We just know that eventually Pakal took on refugees from Tikal, who was an enemy of Calakmul. So did he sort of reject his mom's teachings and go out on his own and do things his own way? Or did his mom also turn against Calakmul? Unfortunately, we don't know. What we do know is that the dynasty that she helped create when she put her son into power ended up being one of the longest running dynasties in Palenque and ran right up until the Classic era, the end of the Classic era, when dynasties in general collapsed. Finally, one more woman that I wanted to mention. I mentioned her name at the beginning. I showed you her name glyph when I was talking about Ishkab el Nab, or Lady Water Lily Hand. Again, we don't exactly know what the significance of that name is. The water lily serpent was an important spiritual force, but why she chose that name, we don't know. She is one of the daughters of the Snake Kingdom. So once again, we're talking about the people of Calakmul or the Kanul dynasty. And she was the child of someone named Yuknom the Great, who again ruled for a very long time, did a lot of very important things. And he was the leader of the Snake dynasty. So some of these other women that we've seen were associated with the Snake dynasty. They got the blessings of the Snake dynasty, but they weren't directly related to the Snake dynasty. In this case, Lady Kabal Nab was one of the daughters of the Snake dynasty. She was the daughter of Yuknom the Great, and she married into the royal dynasty of the smaller polity of Waka. We know she had a lot of political power in the dynasty of Waka, and we know that for a surprising reason that is almost a little bit funny, in my opinion. And the reason is we can barely read the stela erected for her husband, but we can still read hers, right? Remember that I mentioned that sometimes they would pair the stela, husband stela on one side, wife stela on the other side. And in this case, we don't know what her husband said on his stela, but we do know what she said. You can see these glyphs are still really coherent. They're really easy to read. And why does that matter? Why does it matter that that we can read hers but not his. In some cases, it is only coincidental, the things that have survived from the ancient world. And so it could just be coincidence that we can only read hers but not his. But there is a reason why hers survived and his did not. And that's because her husband's was made with low-grade, local limestone. But hers was made from imported, higher-grade limestone. And the artistic work on hers was better. You can see that there are deep cuts, lots of shadows here. That shadow means that the cut is deep. So the sculptor has made sure to cut deeply enough that erosion was slower. The sculptor has made sure that these details would be preserved by time. The sculptor was not quite so concerned with making her husbands. And we think that is because, as the daughter of Yuknom the Great, as the woman who was sent to be in charge of Waka via the Snake Kingdom, we think that they were saying, this woman is more important than this man, right? She is more politically relevant than this man. And if there is ever a dispute between the two, you better take the side of Ishkab al-Nab, or you're going to have to deal with Yuknom the Great from the much bigger city of Calakmul. So again, here are some women who show that ancient Maya women had important political power. And as far as the story of the Americas, they are people who should be taught in that story, but oftentimes are left out of the story. So we know their names, we know what they did. So why are they not taught in history classes? I think that is the next important step, that maybe we don't need to remember the names of every ancient Maya queen, just like we don't remember the names of every European king and queen from the same time. But we should certainly remember folks like Lady Six Sky, for example. The ability to read Maya glyphs has completely changed our understanding of ancient Maya people. And in many ways, we're still catching up with that understanding. So ancient Maya people were once thought, again, I mentioned before that we used to think images of women were images of priests. So we used to think that ancient Maya women were not even portrayed in stone. So that's a pretty big difference, knowing that ancient Maya women had these real positions of political power versus our previous understandings. So that's all thanks to the glyphs. But what we learn about Maya people in schools, what we learn about Maya people in university classes that talk about ancient art, it hasn't really caught up to this. I often see in descriptions of that image that I showed you of Lintel 24, I often see things saying, a Maya woman engaged in bloodletting. Why don't we say her name? We know what her name was. It was Ishkab al-Shok, and that's how we should describe it. Ishkab al-Shok engaged in bloodletting. Although Maya women are mostly described as wives or daughters, some did manage to make it to the highest level of power, and they define themselves on their own in their royal art. So what we're seeing are what they wanted us to know about them, what the woman wanted us to know about them, not filtered through the man's perspective, which I think is really great and really gives us a chance to say things about ancient Maya women that we can't say about women in other cultures. Finally, the theme of Sasa, the birthday celebration, is about place. So I did want to connect this all back to place. Many women were born far from the places that they actually ruled, and they went to a new place when they were very young. Sometimes 12 or 13 years old was when they traveled to a new place. So that must have been very intimidating for them. That said, we have lots of examples of Maya women leaving profound effects, leaving a deep legacy on the places that they moved to. So thank you all very much for your time. I hope you learned a little bit about ancient Maya women. Last thing I wanted to share with you is just if you want to learn more about this subject, obviously there's a lot I can't say in an hour. Again, 5 ancient Maya women was really hard to pick. I left one of my favorites off the list, because there are so many of them that we know the names of, and we know a little bit about their biographies. So a great source for ancient Maya life is Everyday Life in the Ancient Maya World by Tracy Ardren. Lots of great books about the ancient Maya. I picked this one because Tracy Ardren is someone who has studied specifically gender in ancient Mesoamerica. And so she also has a book that she co-edited with Wendy Ashmore called Encountering Maya Women. A little bit out of date. It's from 2007 or 8, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And again, lots of our understanding of the ancient Maya has changed in the last 20, 30 years. So this book is a little bit out of date, but I still think it's a really useful source to get a better idea of the lives of some of these ancient Maya women. I told you about Lady Six Sky. She's one of my personal favorites. I've done a lot of studies of her. I'm actually getting the chance to visit the the city that she ruled over and the city that she was born in a couple of weeks. So I am super pumped about that. And if you want to learn more about Lady Six Sky specifically, you can check out the very readable paper, The Heart and Stomach of a King, a study of the regency of Lady Six Sky at Naranjo, Guatemala by Christoph Helmke. Fabulous paper, talks about not just Lady Six Sky, but it also talks about other ancient rulers who were women and how they navigated political power and the sexism that unfortunately accompanied it for them. Most of the images that I use in this presentation are from Wikipedia, mayaglyphs.org or mayacorpus.org. So thank you all very much. Thanks to them very much. And if y'all are interested in learning more about this material, if you're interested in reading ancient Maya hieroglyphs, I do have classes in Maya glyphs. So please feel free to send me an email, lindsayzj@gmail.com. So again, Sasa, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you all learned something as well. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Zac, for this presentation. It was very informative, and we have many people in the comments. Thank you for the lecture as well. To everyone watching, thank you for joining us for today's session. This was part of our birthday bash, which is one of our major fundraisers. So if you're able to, please do consider donating to SASA. It is very important for us to bring these resources for you. Thank you so much again, and we'll be back with more such events. Have a great day or night.